Hi, I'm Mike Geyer with Exceptional Water Systems. We're going to talk a little bit today about an acronym known as ORP. This acronym is known as Oxidation-Reduction Potential. And what that is it's a measurement of water quality. And actually it's one level of water quality. So it's not water quality as a whole, but I'm going to explain what that means. So when we look at this oxidation reduction potential, it's the water's ability to oxidize and disinfect different contaminants as they enter the water. So it doesn't matter whether it's a swimming pool, it's a lake, a pond, drinking water, etc. But nonetheless, it's that measurement that we use to test the strength of the water. So in other words, it's the water's ability to oxidize and disinfect these different contaminants in there. So typically a rule of thumb is knowing that the higher the number, the higher the ORP number, the higher the oxidizing capacity of that water, of that body of water. So typically you want to see an ORP number anywhere between 650 and 700 or higher. So ideally, and the reason why that is, science proves that at an ORP of about 650 and higher, that's when the water has the ability to disinfect different types of bacteria in the water, say E. coli, fecal coliform bacteria, things of that nature. But nonetheless, they don't live in the water much more than 30 seconds when you have it that high. Okay, so just to give you a base idea, so ideally when you're talking about oxidized or having a higher oxidizing capacity, you want to have that oxidizing capacity present, especially when you have different bathers and swimmers in the water, or if you have a lot of bathers present in the water. Now, that's not a say-all, tell-all number to say that the water is truly safe, and I'm going to go into that a little bit more. There's a lot of levels of understanding of water quality that play another factor into that. But nonetheless, this is just one level of water quality that we're looking at. So I'll break down the rest of it as to what true water quality is and why that is. But nonetheless, we're going to start here. So with oxidized ORP, we also have what are known as the changes in there. So what changes this ORP? So let's talk a little bit about what changes ORP. What changes our ORP number in our water? On the board here, I listed a few elements in here. These are just some of your general elements that you're going to deal with on a regular basis, especially when you're dealing with swimming pools. So one of the first things I have listed on here is pH. pH has a direct relationship with ORP. As my pH starts to rise, my ORP actually falls. So if I say my pH starts to go up, my ORP actually drops. The water becomes weaker as my pH starts to rise. As my pH goes down, it actually raises my ORP level. Okay? So my water actually gets stronger as my pH starts to drop. When I add chlorine to the water, it doesn't matter whether it's 1 part, 2 parts, 3 parts, it doesn't really matter. Nonetheless, when I add chlorine, chlorine is an oxidizer, so it should be increasing the oxidizing capacity of my water. So when I add chlorine, and I add more chlorine to it, or just any chlorine to the water, my ORP number is going to go up. Okay? When I drop chlorine, and my chlorine level falls, my ORP level is going to drop as well. So there's also a direct relationship there. Stabilizer. Stabilizer is also known as cyanuric acid. It's the product a lot of people like to use to help keep the sun from burning your chlorine off in your pool. I wouldn't use it. I don't like it, but nonetheless, people use it all the time. So nonetheless, if we use stabilizer in the water, stabilizer inhibits chlorine from doing its job. So it doesn't allow it to do a very good job, which then it's going to hold that chlorine in the water longer, but it also lowers my ORP number. So as I have more stabilizer in the water, it actually lowers my ORP number. It weakens the chlorine or the water's ability to do its job, actually both of them. As I get rid of stabilizer from the water, it actually raises my ORP level. Hence is why I do not like stabilizer in the water. The only thing it really does is prevents the chlorine from burning off. But if you're not using chlorine, or if you're using some sort of a different system, and we'll talk about those later, you don't necessarily need to have it in your water. It's not a necessity. Temperature. As my temperatures rise, it gets hotter, the ORP potential in my water actually drops, okay? So as temperatures go up, the ORP level actually drops. And that's a very good indication. Is you always heard that warm water actually promotes more bacteria growth and so forth, and that's the reason why. Bacteria actually likes to live in that water, but the oxidation potential is much lower, so it's able to survive in there because that ORP number is so low. Nonetheless, when my temperature actually drops, my ORP number actually goes up. So it's much better to swim in cool water than it is hot water, unless you have it super sanitized properly. Dirt and debris, as dirt and debris enters into your water, obviously the more dirty the water is, it's going to actually lower your ORP number. So as my dirt and debris level starts to rise, your water starts to get cloudy, a lot of people in there, you got different lotions, potions, and whatever else, your ORP level is actually going to drop. As I remove that dirt and debris from the water, and the water gets cleaner, of course, now I have a higher oxidizing capacity once again. So these are just some basics to start off with to understand what ORP does while you're trying to sanitize a body of water. So next we're going to talk a little bit about ORP and its relationship with chlorine. As some of you might know, that ORP is used in a lot of different industries to measure the amount of chlorine in the water. They use it on backyard pools, they use it on commercial pools, they use it for drinking water, wastewater, and so forth. But I'm going to show you how it is, it's an indirect method to measure it, which means, just like I showed you earlier, is that there's a lot of factors to consider before coming up with an ORP number. So with that in mind, let's just take a normal scenario here. So you have a pool, 750 on your ORP. So we have an ORP number of 750, okay? And we're going to start with that. And 750, let's just say on an average pool, you have 3 parts per million of chlorine in this particular body of water. Now, so you have 3 parts per million. Now, if anything changes on those other factors I explained, so whether the pH is going to change, if your chlorine, the amount of chlorine changes in the water, if there's more dirt and debris, if you got more people being added to the water, more oils, lotions, potions, that sort of thing, if you add more stabilizer to the water, this number is going to change, okay? So you're going to have to adjust this number on a regular basis depending on the use of your pool, okay? So we'll talk about just chlorine. So how does it relate to this ORP? Now, if I come in the morning, let's just say, I give my pool time to rest, and after a busy day, you had a lot of swimmers, a lot of bathers come over, maybe you had a lot of dirt and debris come in there, and during the day. And the next day you come in, and your ORP is at, let's just say it's 770, okay? And instead of getting 3 parts per million, you're only getting 1 part per million. So what this tells me is that my water, after leaving it for whatever time period, say it's 12 hours, say it's 24 hours, maybe you gave it more time to rest, and actually your system is circulating more. What this actually tells me is my water has actually gotten cleaner. So knowing that this ORP number went up and I checked my chlorine level, this is actually a good thing to see in your water. A lot of people get nervous about that and they say, well, I don't have my ORP of 750, there's something wrong. Yeah, there's something wrong, is that What's wrong is your pool is actually cleaner, so that's a good thing. So now that means that my new ORP level is going to need to change. So if I had, for say, my set point on, normally you have a chemical controller of some sort, and I'll talk to you a little bit about that, but nonetheless, this would be my set point. So a lot of times you'll set this up. You'll set it up on a controller to try and manage 750 at all times. Well, you wanted to reach 3 parts per million, but now my new set point is not going to be 770 because I'm only going to get 1 part per million at that time. And instead, for every 10 millivolts, okay, so that's 10 millivolts here. 10 millivolts is normally equal to about 1 part per million, okay? It'll raise or lower 1 part per million in that body of water. So if I go to, let's say, 790, so that's 20 parts per million, which should equal, if I add 20 to that, that's 2 parts per million. So that's going to be my new set point. So now my new set point is going to be 790 instead of 750. That's a good thing. So, and over time, as you leave your body of water, let's just say you leave for the weekend, you got a pool, a spa, doesn't matter what it is, and if you come back, and you come back on a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and let's just say, let's get crazy with it, and you're in the 800 range, and you come in and you got 0 parts per million. Now, it doesn't happen very often, but it does happen. That is not a bad thing, okay? Keep that in mind. 800 plus, you got 0 parts per million, that's great. That just means you have super clean water. But keep in mind, your controller or your chlorine is not going to kick in until your ORP or your oxidizing potential of the water actually drops. Then it will start feeding chlorine again. But it's not going to give you 3 parts per million anymore because your water actually changed. So this is kind of a general relationship there. Now I'm going to go over here. We're going to change this. I'm going to go the opposite direction and show you what's going to happen there. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about ORP moving the opposite direction. Now, in this example, I am not going to use a chemical controller in that sense. Only because it'll make it a little easier for you to understand the meaning of ORP, not the controller side of it. So when we have an ORP reading, let's just say it's 750, okay? And at 750, let's say you have 2 parts per million in your water, okay? You have no chemical controller on this particular pool. So if you come in the next day or you test your water the next day and whatever type of reading that you're showing for your ORP, let's just say it drops to 730 ORP. Now, it doesn't mean that you're going to have the same amount, especially if you're hand feeding chlorine into the water. But let's just say, okay, at that same number, you're at 2 parts per million. Whoops. Let's just say you're at 2 parts per million. So what this tells me is my water is actually dirtier. And if you come in, let's say you're using it that whole week, and you have a bunch of friends over, family and so forth, and you're using the pool. And by the end of the week or the weekend comes around, and you've been in the pool for a few days, let's just say it falls into the 680 range, okay? And at 680 range, you're testing your water and so forth. And let's just say you're still at that 2 parts per million. What that's actually telling me, the difference from here to here, is that my water quality is slowly dropping. So this could be numerous different things taking place here. So as I mentioned earlier to you, these other factors, what type of chlorine are you using? How much TDS is added to the water? So is your TDS, because your TDS affects its total dissolved solids, is what that stands for. But nonetheless, as that TDS starts to rise, you actually have more junk in your water. which means it's actually not going to be as clean, which it's not going to have as strong of an oxidizing capacity. So as that TDS starts to go up in there, which is added by all sorts of different people, all sorts of different chemicals and stuff that you add to the water. So that's number one. What type of chlorine? Oh, terrible. What type of chlorine are you using? If you're using the little 3-inch tablets, keep in mind those 3-inch tablets, 50% of those tablets is what they call stabilizer or cyanuric acid. And that stabilizer, as it builds up in that water, it actually is going to slowly lower your ORP level because it actually hinders chlorine from doing its job. So because you're using those on a regular basis and because you have a higher beta load, that's the reason why this ORP number actually dropped, because you're actually adding more chlorine to the water, which is really bad chlorine in my book, but nonetheless, you're adding more of the stabilizer to the water, which lowers your water quality on a regular basis. So I'm not saying that this could actually happen overnight, but I've seen it happen overnight. I've seen, or I should say, over a short period of time, where your ORP does drop pretty drastically. The cleaner you keep your water, the less chemicals you use in your water, the better off you'll be. And as we move on here, I'm going to show you different ways of keeping your water clean so you don't have to add all these chemicals to it, which actually makes your water much healthier. So let's move on to the next. Okay, I'm going to give you a really brief overview on what happens when your ORP goes down and you're using a chemical controller of some sort. Now, let's just start at the same number, 750. And because in most municipalities, they require you to maintain at least a 3 part per million in a pool. So let's just say you're at 3 parts per million here. Same scenario, if you come in the next day and your ORP changes. Now, the next day, because you have a chemical controller, technically you should still be at 750 if your controller is working properly. But now, instead of your ORP dropping, what's going to happen here is you're going to actually come in and it might be 5 parts per million. What does that mean? Well, that means that my actual ORP dropped at least 20 millivolts. So reality is this new ORP level actually dropped to about 730. Okay, and if I was at 730, if I take 20 millivolts, which is 2 parts per million out of there, I would actually be at what? 3 parts per million. So my new set point dropped, and that's because my controller is telling me that, hey, my ORP for a new 750 is 5 parts per million. It's requiring more oxidizer to maintain that 750 than it did 2 days ago, a week ago, whatever time frame that was. So that tells me my water is actually getting dirtier. 1. So could be 1 is dirty water. The other thing this can actually take place is the fact that maybe you added some chemicals to the water. Any type of chemicals you add to your water, doesn't matter what it is, if it's phosphate remover, if it's an algicide, if it's some sort of sodium bicarbonate, etc., etc. When you add chemicals to your water and that chemical actually goes through where your controller is reading, it actually can hinder those probes. So you have 2 probes that are sitting in what they call a flow cell, and it reads the water quality all day long as your system is running. So your probes might be dirty. So over time, if your probes get dirty, then it's not going to read properly. So you might have to take those probes out and clean them. Normally use just a mild dishwashing soap for that, and then rinse them off. Let them read for about 30 minutes or so, put them back in, and off you go again. So nonetheless, your probe can actually be dirty. The other thing is not to mention it's just dirty water and dirty probes, but also what can take place in there is extra chemicals. So when you have a buildup of chemicals over time, and it happens, it's inevitable that over time their TDS is going to go up, and which is going to read TDS. When your TDS rises, is that going to have an effect on your ORP number? Sure, it's going to affect the oxidizing capacity of that water. So these are some just basic things that are going to change that ORP level in the water. There's a lot of other things that actually make that change, but these are some of the most common things that you're going to see that are going to make that change often. So let's move on to the next clip, and I'm going to show you next part here. All right, next we're going to talk a little bit about ORP and AOP. So what is this AOP? So this is a term you might have heard recently over the last several years here, but AOP stands for Advanced Oxidation Process. Okay, it's just another method of actually sanitizing and disinfecting water, and it's by utilizing both ozone and UV systems. So I'm going to show you both the pros and cons to it, but I need to have you understand is how the system works so you get a better understanding of what it does to the strength of the water. I'm not talking about water quality right now. This is one level of water quality, but it's not as a complete, okay? So very important to understand what it does to ORP, and then it'll help you better understand of why it's good in some cases and why it's not good in other cases. But nonetheless, so when we take ozone, be an ozone generator of some sort, it doesn't matter whether it's ambient ozone or whether it's going to be pure oxygen. Nonetheless, you're taking ozone. You actually, as you're running it through, so this is my actual return line for my pool system. So I put in here what's called a bypass valve. It forces the water to run through what they call a venturi. Now this venturi creates a vacuum and it draws in this ozone to the system. So at this point of contact right here where it draws in, as soon as the water and the air mix, which is the ozone in the water, this is where all the disinfecting normally takes place, a lot of it. So when this water actually hits there, you get ozone, you get hydroxyl radicals, whichever process you're using, it doesn't matter. But this is the point where it's actually starting to do its process. So they run it through a UV light. Now it doesn't matter if this is low pressure or what they also call medium pressure. Doesn't matter, either system. When you run ozone through this light, what happens is it actually breaks down that ozone. So depending on the concentration of your ozone, the size of the ozone generator, what are you actually putting out? Normally it's measured in grams per hour. Okay? So how many grams per hour? So the more grams you're putting out per hour, obviously the more that's going to go through this UV chamber. So here's the really interesting part. As you're passing ozone through this UV chamber, it's a great process for destroying different microorganisms in the water. Great process. So when it passes through here, your ORP actually will drop. Okay, it reduces that ORP, and the reason why is because ozone is such a strong sanitizer. It's the strongest natural sanitizer you can get. And when you're using that ozone, when it touches the water, it raises it much higher than chlorine ever can dream of getting to. So you can see ORP levels as high as, let's just say on the inlet side here, it could be going in at 950. Okay? So if you can read that there. So I might have an ORP of 950. I'm going to write that on there. So After it passes through this chamber, what happens is a UV lamp actually breaks down that ozone. So it's going to break off. And ozone, just so you know, is 3 oxygen molecules bound together. Okay? So these 3 oxygen molecules, what happens is it comes through that chamber, it breaks off one of those molecules. Okay? And this hydroxyl radical is what they call it. The oxygen goes back to being O2, and this is actually O1, and actually breaks that down and separate it. This guy will actually disappear once it actually hits that lamp, and through this chamber it happens in literally microseconds. So you have millions of reactions taking place very, very, very fast. So as it's coming out the other end, instead of seeing an ORP of 950, I actually might see an ORP of about 600 or less. So as this process is taking place, it's actually driving my ORP down. And over time, if you leave it run, like on a recirculation system, just like a swimming pool, you'll see your ORP level slowly drop, and it'll actually get all the way back down to even 300 range. Now, for a swimming pool, the question is that good or bad? I get this question a lot. Well, it depends on what you're trying to accomplish. Do you want a low ORP to swim in? It's going to be very difficult for you to maintain a clean and clear pool when your ORP is so low. Why? Because you have no residual left in the water to do any type of disinfecting and oxidizing. Think about going back again. We want to try and maintain an ORP level of 650 or higher. Why is that? Because we already know that science shows that if you're at 650 or higher, it's going to kill bacteria and viruses very quickly as it's in there, so as much as 30 seconds. So, my ORP potential, because it's dropping, that's not good for me. So I need to raise that. So in this sense, this is a great process for cleaning the water, but it does not leave that residual in the water. I'm trying to send that home so you understand that's the difference from it. This is not a bad process at all. This is a great process. The other thing is, you're going to need chlorine in your water or some sort of sanitizer because your ORP is very low. You have a very low oxidizing and potential for the water. So, nonetheless, that's one process. Now let me show you what it's going to do to the body of water. Okay, so now I gave you a basic idea of what the AOP process consists of. Now, you'll see a lot of different systems out there, very small systems and so forth, that say they're AOP methodology. Perfectly fine. At least you get the basic idea of how that system works. Okay, they all work the same. You're going to have ozone coming in, it's going to run through a lamp, and then kicking out the other side, you basically have cleaner water. Yes, that is true. So nonetheless, if I have one body of water, let's just say it doesn't matter what size body of water I have, running with the AOP process. Okay, so as my water comes out, it goes through this system, and it comes out this system and back into this water. So yes, it is clean water, but as I mentioned, just because your process in here might have it run up to anywhere, let's just say for number's sake, 800 ORP, but after it passes through the lamp and everything else it goes through in there, it's actually going to come out this end, and we're just going to keep it at a lower number, 400. So you're kicking out a lower ORP, so which means my oxidizing potential for this body of water is going to be low. I'm going to have a low ORP, and that's just the process. That's just the way it does. Doesn't mean the water is bad, it just means it's clean and it has a lower oxidizing potential. So as you start to add different bathers, start to come into this body of water, okay, I have less oxidizing potential in that body of water. True or false? Yes, that is true. My ORP is low, okay? So which means I am going to have to add a sanitizer because there's no way I'm going to keep up. This system, and I'm going to talk really quick about turnover rate. Let's just say this is 20,000 gallons. Okay? this system would have to turn over extremely fast in order to keep this water clean enough to suffice all these people's dirt, oil, debris, whatever else, sweat, urine, pee, that they're adding to this body of water. So which means it would have to go through this system like, I'm gonna say probably every 15 minutes, okay? That's extremely fast, moving 20,000 gallons through there. You would have to have an entire generator back there, a major water plant in order to handle 15 gallons a minute running through that system. So, and anyways, it's not filling 15 gallons a minute, my bad. That's actually 15 minutes. So it would take a high flow rate to get that water through there in 15 minutes. So nonetheless, that's the only way you're really going to keep this body of water clean. Let's give another scenario over here. If you're using standard ozone system, same thing. As the water comes through this ozone system, okay, still doesn't matter what type of ozone system is, whether it's oxygen fed or whether it's ambient ozone fed, your ORP number coming out the other side is going to be high. Most likely it's going to be in the 900 range. And as it comes out and it comes back into the water, okay, my oxidizing potential of the water is going to be around 900. It's going to have a higher oxidizing potential. So I'm keeping the oxidizing potential high. Once again, it's not saying that this is a bad method. It's just the design of the technology. It works well. But nonetheless, I am leaving my water at a higher oxidizing potential for my bathers and everything that are coming into this water. So same scenario, if I've got people coming into this body of water, my oxidizing potential is much greater. I shouldn't have to use much chlorine if I don't want to. I don't have to use much because chlorine will never hit that type of a number anyways. Or ozone is so powerful, it's 10,000 times more effective at killing microorganisms than chlorine. So it's a very powerful method. This is also a very powerful method. It just doesn't give you any residual in the water. And one thing that the county always wants to see, any of the health departments, to keep a body of water healthy for people to be in, the ORP number has to be high, the oxidizing potential. So that's the game here. That's what we're trying to accomplish, is getting that oxidizing potential very high. So what's another methodology that I could use? Now, if I wanted to go through this process, let's just say, for instance, if I want to keep my ORP really high, I'm going to have to double spend. Okay, if I really want this system for whatever reason, you can put this system in. But then you're going to have to add in an ozone system on the backside. So you're going through this process, and then you're coming up, you go through the ozone, and then you come back. Now, because I'm running ozone on the backside, now I have the opportunity to get this water up to 900 as well. Because this is actually going to leave me with a residual left in the water, whereas this is not. So those of you that struggle with AOP, don't understand why you're using so much chlorine and stuff, that's the reason why, is because it's driving that chlorine level down. Now here's the other kicker to this. Those of you that are actually using chemical controllers of some sort, think about it. If you're trying to maintain 3 parts per million in your body of water, 2 parts, doesn't really matter. Let's just say it's 750. Okay, that's my ORP number. That's what I'm trying to maintain. 750 ORP. Think about it. Every time my water passes through my circulation system or my pump room, it's dropping my ORP, which means now it's coming back in here. When it comes back through my chemical controller, it's going to go, oh, ORP is lower, I got to raise it. So it's constantly feeding chlorine on a regular basis. Why? Because this is dropping your ORP on a regular basis. So you're better off going with a chemical controller of some sort with a ppm probe. It's called ppm probe. A ppm probe in any one of these scenarios, if you want to run chlorine in that body of water, a ppm probe is critical to using when you want to establish 1 part, 2 parts, 3 parts, because you'll never manage ORP properly with these types of systems and trying to keep a residual of chlorine in the water. So this is just another method. This is just another idea of how things actually work in your pool. Let me show you one more. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about ORP and its relationship with pH. So a lot of people actually struggle with different types of facilities where you have a lot of aeration taking place. It can be for a splash pad, it could be for an indoor facility where you're having wave machines, anything where there's a lot of different types of aeration taking place. What you'll find is the thing that people struggle with the most is pH rising relatively fast. So when we have our pH rise quickly, your ORP is going to be affected automatically, regardless of what your set point is going to be on say, a chemical controller. So let's just take 750 for example, and you still have your 3 parts per million of chlorine in there. So a lot of times what's going to take place, as soon as you turn on this particular feature, water feature, and you start adding bodies to that body of water, your pH will rise relatively fast, which is then going to drive your ORP number down, okay? So without giving this a specific number, because it can be anything actually, so let's just say it's going to drop, say, 720. Now at 720, we already know that's a 30 millivolt difference, 30 millivolts, which is typically equal to, as I mentioned earlier, 1 part per million is about 10 millivolts, roughly. So we're going to say it's going to drop 3 parts per million. But in actuality, your chemical controller is trying to maintain 750. So what's actually going to take place, it's going to add this 3 parts per million to this 3 parts per million that's already existing, regardless of what your set point is. Because all the chemical controller knows is, I need to maintain this number. It's not looking at parts per million as a direct number anymore, because it's not directly related like that. This is actually an indirect method of measuring chlorine in the water. So it goes back to that chart I said. So over the summertime, if you're adding stabilizer to the water and that stabilizer starts to rise, your ORP number is going to slowly drop. Your probes get dirty, your ORP is going to drop. It's going to overfeed. So you're going to constantly be playing with that on a regular basis. One of the easy ways to get away from something like this, where you're having that type of issue, is going with what they call a ppm probe. ppm. And what a ppm probe does is it measures just the parts per million of chlorine in the water. It doesn't care what ORP is doing, and it doesn't care about what your pH is doing. It's strictly just measuring the amount of chlorine in the water. So these ppm probes actually work very well for those types of facilities where you have a lot of aeration taking place, any type of play features and so forth like we discussed. The other thing they work really well on is very large bodies of water. You can save a tremendous amount of money by going with a ppm probe on large pools. And I'm talking pools 500,000 gallons plus. And when you have that large of a swimming pool, if you're relying on ORP to do it, when your temperature rises and anything, bathers, aeration, all of those different factors I listed over there, anytime that pH starts to rise for any reason, this number is automatically going to drop, which means you're going to overfeed a 500,000 gallon pool, plus can go all the way up to 1 million, 2 million gallons. You're going to constantly overfeed that water unnecessarily, which then in turn over time is going to cost you a lot more money that you don't need to spend on that size of a pool. So nonetheless, ppm probe works great. It maintains a specific parts per million in there, and you don't have to worry about this number that's going to be ever changing based on bather load and all these other factors. So a very good methodology to use if you're trying to maintain a large body of water or something that's heavily aerated. So let's move on to one more section and then we'll wrap this section. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about ORP in its most natural state. So what do I mean by that? If you were to go out into Mother Nature and find a natural body of water, it doesn't matter if it's a lake, a stream, a spring coming out of the mountain and so forth, most likely you're going to find an ORP level of anywhere from 100 all the way up to 500. Now granted, I've never seen anything as high as 500. That doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. I've just never measured anything myself that high. But nonetheless, this is typically what you're going to see out there. And one of the #1 drivers of ORP in nature is oxygen. So the amount of dissolved oxygen in a body of water, whether it's a lake, a stream, a spring, whatever, that's what determines your ORP number. So the higher the number, the higher the amount of oxygen in that body of water, the more healthy it is. So technically, this is how they determine how healthy a body of water is going to be based on the amount of oxygen in that lake. And if you think about it, if a lake starts to lose its oxygen, it actually becomes more acidic. And then the fish start dying, they get stressed out and so forth in there. You get a lot of algae growth and all sorts of other growth in that particular lake, and it becomes more acidic. So as the oxygen rises in that lake, naturally through streams, through waterfalls, etc., that oxygen rises, your ORP also rises, and then of course the fish can thrive and other plant life and so forth in there. The water actually becomes much cleaner. So this is one level I did want to hit, just a natural number of ORP looking at. The other thing is that I get a lot of people asking about ORP in drinking water. So this is your most natural state. So technically when you're drinking water, you would want a lower ORP number than having a higher ORP number. Because remember, the only time, if this is my natural state, this is typically what I'm going to start with, without any type of oxidizer in there. There's no ozone, there's no chlorine or anything like that in the water. This is where I'm starting at right here. And as my ORP starts to rise, or if I'm trying to change it with some man-made product, of course I'm going to raise that ORP to a much, much higher number. But that means that you're doing it other than a natural way. So with that in mind, technically, you want to be drinking water that's actually got a low ORP. And in some places, you'll find some companies can actually get the ORP to a negative, believe it or not, 500, which is actually super healthy for the body. And this is something you can actually research on Google and so forth. You might find different companies that kind of go a little bit more in depth and understanding of water quality. But for this video, we're not really going to get into that too much. I just want to give you a general overview of ORP. So this concludes our educational session on ORP. Thanks again for watching the video. I know there's a lot of information that we covered during this video, so if you have any questions whatsoever on the different levels of ORP in there, please don't hesitate to contact us. We'd be more than happy to go through some of those. We are going to be doing more videos coming out here on water quality. I know we talked about that a little bit, but we're going to go into more in depth on different levels of water quality. But thanks again for watching. God bless.